Hi everyone. This week we are going to be talking about culture. Now, this is always one of my favorite weeks of the entire semester because, as we'll talk about from a sociological perspective, culture is really the foundation of everything that we study in a sociology course, right? If you remember back to the beginning of the semester when we introduced the term sociology and the term society, we talked about how a society is a group of people that share some sort of physical region or space and a culture. So, a culture, of course, is going to be a shared system of a group of people's values and beliefs and customs. And as we'll talk about in our discussions and our lectures for this particular session, culture is really the fabric of human life. The shared systems of meaning and values and beliefs that we have affect how we behave and operate every single day of our lives. And as we'll talk about today, culture is something that we really heavily take for granted. It's not something that we consciously think about every day, but it guides almost all of our behaviors, even without us knowing about it, which is why it's such a powerful tool in our society. As we'll also talk about, culture is a really important aspect for us to study as sociologists because we tend to have really firmly held beliefs and ideas that our culture is the best and it's the way that it should be everywhere around the world. And of course, that's not the same. As all of you are probably aware, cultures are very different from one society to the next, from one country to the next, etc. And many of us occupy multiple different cultures. We're part of many different cultures in our own lives, so we can hopefully draw on a lot of personal experiences to reflect upon as we talk about the many different facets of culture that we'll be unpacking in this week's presentations. So to begin, I would like you to think about this hypothetical scenario and consider what you would do. What would you do if you were eating at a restaurant on a cold winter day? Now imagine a cold winter day is in a cold day in the Midwest. I know our winters don't get too chilly down here in South Texas, but back where I came from in North Dakota, in the winter it could get as cold as, the 10s, the 20s, even below zero at times. So think a cold winter day, and you were eating inside of a restaurant, and you saw a couple walk up to the restaurant with a baby, and they left the baby at the entrance outside in a carriage, and then they proceeded to go into the restaurant themselves. What would you do? What would you do if you saw a couple leave their baby outside on the sidewalk in the middle of winter and then came inside to a restaurant to eat? Now, almost every time I pose this question to students in a typical class, people would say things like, well, I would flag down a worker at the restaurant or the manager and let them know that this couple just came in and left their baby outside. Some people say they would go up to the couple directly and say, hey, you left your baby outside, what are you doing? Other people even say they would call 911 or call Child Protective Services and report this incident of neglect. Now, those are all answers that we could expect here in the United States because, of course, leaving a baby outside of a restaurant on the sidewalk is definitely not a cultural practice that we are familiar with here in the US, right? That is not something we would ever do here in our society. However, in other societies around the world, this actually is a fairly common practice. So this actually happened in the US about 25 years ago now. There was a couple who was in New York City, and it was a day in, I think, May, and they went inside a restaurant and they left their 14-month-old child outside on the sidewalk in a baby carriage while they went inside to eat their lunch or to dine. And of course, this caused a pretty big stir inside the restaurant. There are people looking outside that saw this couple just leave their baby in its carriage outside of the restaurant front door, and they just came inside. And people got kind of shook, and the restaurant staff was notified, the police got involved, and this woman actually ended up getting arrested. So you can see this headline from the time. It caused quite a stir in the media. The woman who got arrested was quoted saying, "I got arrested for leaving my baby outside a restaurant." Now, most of us that are from the United States and have lived here our whole lives would probably think, well, and rightfully so, this seems like a pretty appropriate response to this type of behavior. However, we come to find later on that this mother who left her child outside is actually from Denmark. And in Denmark, it's a common practice for parents to leave their babies outside of restaurants or boutiques, schools, even at their own homes, etc., to nap in the cold. So I got a quick video here to watch that kind of explains this cultural practice in a little more detail before we unpack this more directly with the sociological mind. So, like that video said, this is a pretty common practice of parents leaving their young babies outside in carriages, even on cold winter days, to nap. In fact, there's even some scientific evidence that supports this as a healthy practice. Some studies even suggest that letting babies sleep outside can improve their brain function as they mature into young children and later into adolescence. So there's even some evidence that this not only might be an acceptable practice, but actually a beneficial practice. And like it was said in there, this is not just something that people from Denmark do. This is a really common practice in many different Scandinavian countries. And so while it's not something that we practice in the United States, it is something that is commonly practiced in other cultures around the world. I'll never forget my very first semester teaching here at TAMU-CC. I actually had a student in my class who was from Sweden, and just as all the other students in our classroom were getting so worked up, like, why would a parent ever leave a baby outside? The student spoke up and said, actually, yeah, this happens all the time in my country. You know, this is very common to be walking down a city sidewalk or a city street and see carriages lined up outside, just like in this image here. This is a common practice in other countries around the world. And later on, this mother, that again, the same one from this example from about 20 years ago, she was interviewed by a lot of media, right? Because this was a very controversial story that was breaking in the news. And she said that while people in the US are kind of socialized or taught to live in fear, being fearful of leaving children unattended, especially in a city as busy as New York, in Denmark, however, in a lot of Scandinavian countries, there's actually this really deep sense of trust in one another. There's actually a term for it that I can't remember off the top of my head, but in other cultures, there's actually a term for this deep sense of trust and kind of camaraderie and companionship that people of society have with one another. They trust that one another are going to look out for each other. Even if they're total strangers, there isn't that same level of constant fear that we tend to live in the United States here, specifically over protecting our children and youth in our society. We would never leave a baby outside because we'd be afraid that, the baby would get abducted or someone might cause harm to the child. But in other countries around the world, that's not a common cultural value to have. They don't live in fear. They actually live in support of one another. So that, coupled with the science that napping outside is healthy, those are cultural practices and cultural norms that are heavily indoctrinated and a part of the society in these different countries around the world. And they're not a part of our society here. They're not a part of our culture. But that doesn't mean that our culture is right, and in this instance, the Scandinavian culture is wrong. It just means that we have a different system of values, beliefs, and customs that is dependent on the society that we're a part of, right? So, why are the parenting customs of parents from Denmark and the US so vastly different? The real simple answer to this question is culture. It all boils down to culture. Every society around the world has a different system of values, belief, and practices depending on the practices that have been produced and reproduced for generations before them. So let's talk a little more in depth about what culture exactly is. So when we're talking about a culture, we're talking about a group, or we could even say a society's shared system of practices, language, values, and beliefs. Now we're going to talk about what all of these terms, values, beliefs, language, etc., mean throughout this series of presentations this week. But for now, let's just boil it down to a culture is pretty much a society's shared way of life. It's the way we live, it's the way we act, the way we operate, the way we think about things, right? So if we thought for a second, well, what are some examples of American culture? Or we could say culture in the United States, right? Well, one example, a practice that we all share in the United States is driving on the right side of the road, right? That's something that to us is a quote unquote normal or expected aspect or behavior of American practices. However, if you know about other countries around the world, that's not the case. For example, in the United Kingdom, they drive on the left side of the road. So they have a different cultural practice in terms of driving than we do in the United States. Another common cultural practice in the US is this custom of shaking someone's hand when you meet them for the first time, right? If you are, for example, applying for a job and you go into your interview and your potential boss is there, you're probably going to extend your hand when you introduce yourself as an offer to shake that person's hand because that's how we're socialized to greet people in the United States, right? That's our custom that we have. Of course, that's shifting now thanks to COVID, right? It'll be interesting to see how our society adapts and changes our culture in response to this cultural change that we're experiencing, right? In the era of COVID, human contact is now becoming taboo, right? We're social distancing instead of shaking hands anymore. We're more likely to just wave to people from 6 feet away, maybe flash them a peace sign, or even just show them a smile as an introduction. So it'll be interesting to see how our society adapts our culture in response to this societal change that we're experiencing. And another form of an aspect of American culture is supporting freedom of speech, right? In the United States, a value that we hold very strongly to is our First Amendment right, that everyone has the right to vocalize their opinions on a public platform. And that's not the same in all societies around the world. Some societies have really strict censorship rules that limit people's ability to vocalize or to speak whatever they think or whatever they want, right? So those are just a few examples of American culture. We could come up with hundreds of other examples, but let's talk more specifically now about Texas culture. So something you'll come to realize as we talk about culture throughout these presentations is that every single one of us belongs to multiple different cultures, right? For every different society that we're a part of, for every different group that we're a part of in our lived experiences, there's probably a shared way of doing things, a shared value system that you might have, right? So for example, you all might have indoctrinated into United States culture as well as being Texas culture. If you practice a certain religion, for example, you might be kind of socialized into Catholic culture or into Jewish culture, right? Depending on the region that you're from, you might be, associated with Southern culture versus Northwestern culture. So we're part of many different cultures. And one of them, obviously, Texas culture. So what would you say are some customs or practices, aspects of language or value systems that are common for people living in Texas? What do you think? So whenever I ask this question, I typically get the exact same responses, which just shows how widely practiced Texas culture is and how easily identifiable some of these customs are. First one, Southern hospitality. People in the South, especially down here, just tend to be pretty kind, pretty nice, pretty laid back. I was really surprised when I moved here from the city of Milwaukee, which is a pretty big sized city and kind of has this like dog eat dog mentality. You definitely wouldn't just like wave or say hi to a stranger you're crossing on the street. You'd get a really weird look from someone. Driving in Milwaukee was very cutthroat. If you cut someone off or try and merge into their lane, you'd probably get honked at or get flicked off. Down here, I was so surprised with how friendly and kind people were. When I was driving, I think one of the first days here, I literally had a car stop traffic on a really busy street and wave me in so I could pull in, and that was something I wasn't really used to. So Southern hospitality, definitely an aspect of Southern culture. Appreciation for barbecue and Whataburger, right? The cultural preference for fast food in Texas definitely caters towards Whataburger, right? Versus like a McDonald's or a Burger King or a Hardee's, etc. So that's a shared practice or a shared value system, right? We value this particular fast food establishment over others. And the practice of saying y'all, right? The linguistic practice, right? I love this little chart down here. I think it's pretty accurate. You know, if it's one person, it's you. If it's two, it's y'all. And three or more, all y'all. So these are just some examples of Texas culture that we all share living in this region.